That what?
Yeah, never mind.
Okay.
Just go right there. Put your place in the center of this.
I'll learn in a minute. Yeah. I mean, it's so good to see you again. And thank you so much for coming. You know, an out of town speaker, and in person is just fantastic. And for everybody who made their way to the donkey barn, isn't this the cutest thing you've ever seen? It was built in 1920 of that same rolling rock like the pavilions. It is 3 stories tall because this is higher than down at the beginning or at the front end of it. And it's where they stored the donkeys and all of the hay for them. And there used to be 3 buildings like this, but 2 have been turned down. So we have this one. At this time, it is being turned into the marketing department. So that will be putting, you know, you got 3 stories here where you can build little offices. So that's what's going on. Okay, so now did I lose it? Get back to Dr. Kramer. I know where he went to school for his undergraduate degree because we were at the same school. We both went to Texas Lutheran University in Seguin, although he was a senior when I was a freshman. So I knew who he was, but he didn't know who I was. So what our topic is going to be about tonight is a history of water in the state of Texas. He gave a program similar to us about this when we had our 25th year anniversary, and it was fascinating about how things like Vista Ridge projects were viewed in the 60s. And I was like, we really need to hear that again and see how these things are playing now. He went to GLU and then he got his PhD in political science from Rice University. His dissertation was on the implementation of federal air and water pollution control policy in Texas. He has so many awards from so many people, like the governor and all of these people. And
Not the cart, though.
oh yeah, really? Yeah,
You take the seats.
yeah. Who would want one from him? Yeah. And then also he currently serves on the Region H water planning group. And is that like Houston and Brenham? That area. Yeah. And then, oh, here it says Brazos River Basin, Trinity, and San Jacinto River Basin, Galveston Bay. He is also the editor of The Living Waters of Texas, published by Texas A&M University Press in 2010. So if you would come up and unfortunately you have to come up here because of the audio and everything, but we're so happy to have you.
Thank you, Karen. So thanks, everybody. I'm very happy to be in San Antonio. I actually have a great love for San Antonio, even though during the 1990s, San Antonio didn't have a great love for me or the Sierra Club. But as Karen said, I went to Texas Lutheran in Seguin as an undergraduate, and so I spent a lot of time in San Antonio during my college years. And then, and actually, I think the first vacation trip that my family and I ever took was to San Antonio, New Braunfels when I was 3 years old. So I was probably here at Breckenridge Park when I was 3 years old. That was probably the first time. And my wife and I actually got engaged on the Riverwalk. So it carries a lot of memories for me. But the reason I'm here tonight really is to talk about water, but from a state perspective. You know, this afternoon, some of us were on a WebEx virtual meeting with the San Antonio Water System people about the San Antonio Water Management Plan update for 2022. And I'm not going to really focus on that tonight because obviously many of you know a lot more about San Antonio water issues than I do. I want to focus on sort of where all this fits into the context of Texas water over literally the last 50 years or so, because my original entry, if you will, into the water realm in Texas was as a result of the 1969 vote on the 1978 Texas Water Plan. And I want to tell you a little bit about the water plan of 68, what sparked it, what it sort of meant in terms of the proposals. And I have to say that if you think that things are bad now in terms of water policy in the state of Texas, let me tell you that they're a hell of a lot better now than they were in the late 1960s. But before I go any further, I want to just express my appreciation to the Alamo group of the Sierra Club, because she's been very involved in water issues for a very long period of time. Probably one of the most involved regional Sierra Club groups in the state on the water issue. And you've certainly been on the front lines of the 1990s controversy over the Edwards Aquifer and continue to be on the front lines. I want to recognize that there are many individuals that have contributed to the water effort by the Sierra Club over the years, but I want to particularly acknowledge Meredith McGuire here tonight. Meredith actually was the recipient of a state chapter award on water, I think 2 years ago, 2020. And it is, the award is very important to me because it's named the Ken Kramer Living Waters Award. I was the first recipient of the Living Waters Award by the chapter, and so it's after that it was named for me. Now, I have to say that I was a little concerned when I found out they named this award after me. One of the reasons is that we have a few awards at the Lone Star chapter level that are named after individuals, but they were all named after individuals who had already passed away. And so when they named the award after me, I had some mixed emotions. Like, do they know something I don't know? But I think it's been about 10 years now, and I'm still here, so I think we're okay. But thank you, Meredith, for all your work. And I really appreciate the fact that you got that award. You know, the Lone Star chapter has actually been involved in water issues since the 1960s. And in some ways, it was the fight over the 1968 Texas Water Plan that actually put the Sierra Club on the map in Texas politically. And I think that's an important point to recognize. So I'm going to talk about the 68 water plan, but I'm going to talk about other proposals to move massive amounts of water, which many of you are familiar with, and sort of where we are today, the progress we've made, the challenges that remain, and so where I think we should go from here as the Sierra Club. So I think you all know that the event that really led to the 68 water plan was a historic drought record of the 1950s. From roughly 1950 to 1957, although some people would argue it actually started in some parts of the state in 1947. But it is still the worst multi-year drought we've had in Texas, although 2011, or really specifically, I guess, was October 2010 through September 2011, was the worst one-year drought we've had in Texas history, in recorded history. Now, there have been droughts before people were here and recording those droughts, and some of them were probably even longer and more intense than the 1950s drought, but that's still sort of a benchmark for our state's water planning. And so that sparked the development of the Texas Water Development Board, some binding authority to build reservoirs, and this planning process that resulted in the 1968 Texas Water Plan, although there were some water plans prior to that. The 1968 Texas Water Plan was devised at a time when Texas had a population, if you can believe it, of only about 10 million people. The 1968 plan, though, projected that by 2020, which was 2 years ago, we would have 30 million people in Texas. But probably most importantly, what it projected was that whereas in 1968 or so, the state of Texas used about 2 million acre-feet of water for municipal and industrial purposes. The estimate of the water plan was that by 2020, we would be using basically 22 million acre-feet of water. That was 12 million acre-feet of municipal industrial, so almost a 5 to 6 fold increase, and then about 8 million, 9 million for irrigation, agriculture irrigation. So what was the proposal then to provide for this additional water? Well, some of it was building reservoirs within the state and other capacity within the state, but the big part of it was to import 12 to 13 million acre-feet of water each year from the Mississippi River, to take it below New Orleans and bring it across Louisiana to the Gulf Coast of Texas, and then basically move it up the Sabine or the Trinity River to a point near Dallas, and then have a canal that would take the water from near Dallas all the way to Lubbock in the High Plains, about 3,300 feet in elevation above where it would be pumped. And then if they could get Mexico to agree to be part of it, they're going to take part of that water from the Lubbock area and put it into New Mexico. The rest of the water would go from the Lubbock area down to El Paso and provide water for irrigation in the Trans-Pecos region. I think it goes without saying this was a rather grandiose idea. Now, I don't think anybody actually checked with the people along the Mississippi River to make sure that they thought that they could give up their water to Texas. But, being Texans, we think of ourselves as the center of the universe. And so obviously people want to support our growth at the expense of their own, potentially. I think one of the interesting things about this also was that it would have taken the water not just up to the Panhandle and out to West Texas, but also there was a canal or pipeline that would take it from the Gulf Coast down all the way to Corpus Christi and to the lower Rio Grande Valley. So it would basically, touch on many parts of the state because they wanted to be sure that everybody felt they had a stake in the Texas water plan. There were many new reservoirs that would have been constructed. I think you could probably imagine that because of the pumping, that it was going to require a hell of a lot of energy, electricity. And I think it was estimated that it would require about 37% more electrical energy than the whole state of Texas was using at the time, just to move this water around the state. And the estimate just for the water plan in 1968 was $13 billion. And that, of course, is in 1968 terms. I'm not sure what it would be today. So what happened to the water plan? Well, it had a lot of support from a lot of politicians, a lot of local government leaders, a lot of business people. But it did have some opposition. And the saving grace for the environment was that the 1968 water plan required basically that you had to go to the Texas voters to get approval for a certain amount of bonded indebtedness that would pay for part of, and I emphasize part of, the construction of the implementation of the plan. And specifically what they needed to ask for was about $3.5 billion in bonding authorization at the state level. I'm sure you probably know that because of our state constitution, if you want the state to be able to go into debt, you have to pass a constitutional amendment to give the authorization for that bonded indebtedness. And so in 1969, they went to the voters of the state with the proposed constitutional amendment to provide $3.5 billion to the Water Development Board for bonded indebtedness. to build some of the projects that would be part of the plan. That 3.5 billion was a pretty big figure in 1969. In 1969 or thereabouts, it was estimated that the total indebtedness of all Texas state agencies, all Texas counties, all Texas municipalities, all school districts in Texas, and all other types of special districts in Texas was a total of about $5 billion. In other words, 3.5 billion would have astronomically increased the bonded indebtedness of entities in Texas, government entities in Texas. So what happened? Well, fortunately, as a result of very active effort by a lot of groups, including especially the Sierra Club and many fiscal conservatives, the proposal was defeated on August 5th, 1969. But it was only defeated by about 6,000 votes out of 625,000 votes cast. In other words, about 1%, basically. And that was one of the reasons why we can say truly that the Sierra Club, even though, you know, it didn't have as many members as today, helped to make a difference because they actively worked against the water proposal. I was not, I wasn't a member of the Sierra Club yet. I was just starting graduate school in 1969. And the first time I actually heard about the proposal that I recall at least was an article in the Texas Observer, who I'm sure many of you are aware of the Observer, very progressive publication. It was August 1st, 1969 issue of the Texas Observer. And on the cover of the Observer, obviously their visuals were not as great then as they are now. There was a picture or a drawing of John Connally, who was recently governor of Texas, Preston Smith, who was then governor of Texas, and then former governors Alan Shivers and Price Daniel, enjoying the comforts of water skiing, standing on the side of the water canal or planting crops up there. I guess that was Preston Smith who was planting crops up there. And the whole issue, Observer, was dedicated to the Texas water plan, the biggest boondoggle in history. There was an interesting satirical article in the Observer in that issue that was called the Texas Mountain Plan. And the Texas Mountain Plan was a satire that pointed out that Texas had no like ski mountains, and we need to import mountains into Texas so that people could ski and enjoy that particular pastime. You know, it was a parody, but it was obviously pretty much his point. If you guys are really interested in the 1968 water plan, you can go to the Texas Observer website, and they have an archive of all their past issues. And look for the August 1st, 1969 issue, because the entire issue is a PDF there on their website. And I highly recommend it for entertaining reading. And you can see the map of the canals and pipelines that would take water all across the state. So, as I said, this sort of put Sierra Club on the map initially, but, you know, Texans are not easily dissuaded from great ideas. And so the politicians of the state didn't really, you know, just jettison the idea of the Texas water plan. They came back later with certain bites of the apple, if you will. And so in 1976, for example, there was a proposal for $400 billion in bonded indebtedness for water projects or water supply. There was also a proposal for $200 billion in water quality bonds to do wastewater treatment plants and things like that. And the Sierra Club opposed the water supply measure, did not take a position on the water quality measure. They actually didn't have a problem with it, but they didn't want to confuse the voters by being for one voter, one water proposal and not for the other. But what Sierra Club did that time, which I think was very smart, they really created what was, in essence, a front organization called Citizens Against Water Taxes. And they were able then to get, people were not necessarily environmentalists, but they were fiscal conservatives to come on board in opposing the water supply bond proposal. And that was a successful effort. Many of you remember Stuart Henry, who was Sierra Club lobbyist for many years, and then our attorney in a lot of litigation, including part of the Edwards litigation. He was basically the ramrod for Citizens Against Water Taxes. So what happened? 1976, the water supply bond proposal went down to defeat. The $400 billion was defeated by about 300,000 votes that time in a much bigger turnout. And interestingly enough, the water quality bonds were approved by the voters by about 100,000, which indicated that people were making a decision with some understanding that they were for cleaning up water quality, but they were opposed to the water projects that they didn't feel to be necessary or might harm the environment. So that was pretty gratifying. And then in 1981, there was a more grandiose proposal in 1976. Billy Clayton was then the Speaker of the Texas House. He was a West Texas representative who was very outspoken about the need for building water projects. And he came up with what was called a water trust fund proposal. And what that would have done is it would have taken any surplus tax revenue that was not appropriated during any particular session of the legislature and put that excess state revenue into a water trust fund from which water projects could be funded. That was a time when the state of Texas had pretty regular surpluses in their budgets so that they didn't have to spend all the tax revenue money. Interestingly enough, a few years after proposal, we went into basically a period of at least a decade or two where we pretty much had deficits that had to be dealt with. Now we're sort of back, at least temporarily, into a surplus situation. But that water trust fund was again opposed by Citizens Against Water Taxes, and it went down to defeat by over 120,000 votes out of 800,000 cast. A little bit better margin than the 1968 Texas Water Plan proposal. So the gist of all that, and why I pointed out, is that because the environmentalists and the fiscal conservatives were able to defeat all three of those proposals in 69, 76, and 81, some state political leaders finally got it through their thick skulls that, we ought to start talking to these people and bringing them into the discussion and maybe looking at water from a more holistic view, not just water supply, but and not just building new projects, but actually managing water. And Lieutenant Governor Hobby was probably really the leader of that effort. And Hobby had actually opposed some of the water proposals initially, and because he didn't think they were necessary, he thought they were, far beyond what was needed. So thanks to him, some of the environmental groups like Sierra Club especially were brought into the discussion. And I won't go into all the details about that because it's pretty complicated. But as a result, in 1985, there was legislation passed, was known as the state water package, that did include some money for water projects, but it also included some requirements for water conservation, like any entity coming to the Water Development Board for a loan for a water project would have to prepare and submit a water conservation plan and give it to the Water Development Board. It wasn't dictated what had to be in the conservation plan, but it just required you to develop that plan so you had some program for water conservation. There were also some requirements dealing with providing certain water for environmental flows, in-stream flows for rivers, and then freshwater inflows to bays and estuaries whenever a project might be built. And it had to be a consideration in the issuance of water rights permit for surface water rights, how it would impact upon environmental flows. So again, it didn't guarantee that you would necessarily be protecting environmental flows, but it had to be part of the discussion, part of the consideration about whether or not to issue a water right and to build a project. Sierra Club was heavily involved in that legislation, and as a result, the club, and I was involved by that point, took a neutral stance on the proposed water project funding measure that had to go to the voters. It was like $980 million. But it also included not just water development projects, but wastewater projects and flood control, things of that nature. And in part because Sierra Club was not out there opposing it, although some environmental groups still did oppose it. The measure actually passed by 74% to 26% at the polls. So it demonstrated, I think, that groups like the Sierra Club have some clout and that are being brought into the discussion and actually having a package result that included management of water, not just development of water, and money for wastewater projects and flood control projects, not just water supply projects, was important. Now, this doesn't mean, though, that people who dreamt of big, grandiose water development projects had quit dreaming. So there were still efforts to import water from like the Arkansas River in Arkansas, because obviously Arkansas would want to give their water to Texas because we're so good. That really never went anywhere. There was a lot of discussion about it. There was some multi-state planning group set up in Texas that was basically a cover for trying to get water imported into the state. It eventually failed. And then there was the Trans-Texas Water Program, initiated by the Water Development Board in 1994, I believe. And it was able to start because in the, I think, 1993 session of the legislature passed a law that repealed a previous provision of the Water Code. And that provision of the Water Code had prohibited transfers of water within the state of Texas by people who wanted to oppose things like the Vista Ridge pipeline, for example. And once that particular measure was basically eliminated, the Water Development Board thought, oh, well, okay, then we can talk about moving water around the state of Texas again. So they did. And they did like a 5-year study of the possibilities of moving water around the state. But what happened in 1997 was that the legislature passed this big new omnibus water bill, largely at the behest of Lieutenant Governor Bob Bullock at the time. It was sort of prompted again by drought. There was a drought in the mid-1990s, not as severe as the 1950s, but still it caught everybody's attention. And Lieutenant Governor Bullock thought, we spent all this money on planning for water supply, and we still have droughts, and we still don't have really a responsible plan for addressing our water needs. And so he convened a lot of groups, stakeholder groups, to talk about water. I participated in one of those stakeholder groups. Eventually, what came out was, a proposal in 1997 that eventually became known as Senate Bill 1. And that dramatically changed the state water planning process. Whereas from the late 1950s through the early 1990s, the water planning process had been what was known as the top-down planning process, where state agencies like the Water Development Board, basically developed the plan for the state, with some public input, put it out to the public, got, their feedback, sort of like the SAWS water management plans, where they sort of develop their plan and they, then send it out, they get some input, then they send it out to everybody else to get comments. But it's like, it's drafted by the people in the agencies, basically is what it was. And so, look, others decided that's not the way we should do it. We should flip it. And we should have a bottom-up planning process where we go and establish different water planning regions, have a stakeholder group in each region, and that stakeholder group comes up with a regional water plan, and then the regional water plans are aggregated into the state water plan, with some overall state context. And so that's what was adopted by the legislature in 1997. And once that was done, the Water Development Board basically eliminated the Trans-Texas Water Program because it was clear that there was going to be a different planning process, and they weren't the ones that were going to control it. Although they did get the responsibility for devising the rules under which the planning process would operate. Now, I do have to say that the Senate Bill 1 in 1997 did not just deal with planning, and it did a lot of other very important things. It established new requirements for water conservation planning and for drought contingency planning that went beyond what the 1985 water package had done. It also established a Texas Water Trust where people could put surface water rights into a trust to prevent cancellation of those rights. And those rights could be dedicated for in-stream flows or freshwater inflows to basin estuaries. Also, and this was an important thing, which has had some major impacts, some positive, some negative. It basically changed a lot of the law governing interbasin transfers of surface water, like from, let's say, East Texas to another basin. And it said that basically you had to get permission, of course, for the water from the TCQ now then Texas Water Commission. Then actually, that point it was already called Texas Natural Resource Conservation Commission. They had to approve an interbasin transfer of water, but there are all these criteria that they had to evaluate in order to approve of interbasin transfer. But the key thing was that if an interbasin transfer of water occurred from one basin to another, the amount of water that was being transferred from the basin of origin became a junior water right within the basin of origin. What that means is that if you're familiar with Texas surface water law, it's based on priority dates of when you received your water right. So if you received your water right decades ago, before other people in the basin received their water right, your water right has a priority. It's considered to be a senior water right. The ones that received their rights most recently are the most junior water rights. So under the change made in 1997 for surface water law, if you got an interbasin transfer water approved, whatever water was taken out of the basin of origin and transferred to a different water basin became junior to all the other water rights within the basin of origin. And that would mean that there really wasn't a great deal of value for the water being transferred to even the basin receiving the water, because in a drought situation, your water right would be the first one cut off, and therefore you could not depend upon that water being transferred. Now, the reason why I say that is so important is that it really has put the kibosh, if you will, on interbasin transfers of surface water for the most part. I think there have been a few minor ones that have been approved, but not very many. But what it did was to then, unfortunately, put pressure on groundwater as the potential source of water to be transferred from one area to another. So you have things like this ridge, you know, rather than San Antonio going out, say, to the Colorado River and seeking an interbasin transfer of water from the Colorado to San Antonio, they're going out and looking at groundwater resources because the same, you know, system does not apply to groundwater resources. So that was the, you know, maybe the unintended consequence, but it certainly has had an impact upon water in Texas. So in terms of water planning, where did SB1 leave us? Well, 16 regional water planning areas were created. There's a regional water planning group, each of those. San Antonio's in Region L, as many of you know. And Houston, for example, is in Region H. I'm a member now of the Region H water planning group, sort of Houston, Galveston area, part of that greater metropolitan Houston area. And every 5 years, the planning group comes up with a recommended plan that has to go to the Water Development Board for approval. Once it's approved, it's aggregated into a state water plan. And so you have this sort of constant revision of water planning in each region of the state and for the state as a whole, which I think is a good thing, in part because it's hard, you know, the planning is done on a 50-year planning horizon, but it means that basically you can revise that plan every 5 years based upon new information, new data, new circumstances. And I think that's a valuable thing. Now, whether it has to be every 5 years or every 10 years, I don't know, but 5 years is what's in vogue now. And so I think that is something that I would rate as a positive thing because you got foreign people involved in water planning. This doesn't mean it's perfect because you still have water purveyors, if you will, who are very active, if not dominant, on some of these regional water planning groups. But you have some areas like the Region D water planning group up in Northeast Texas is pretty dominated now by people who want to prevent the building of the Marvin Nichols Reservoir in Northeast Texas and want to prevent water being transferred from their area to other regions of the state, like the Dallas-Fort Worth area. So, you know, it's sort of varies from one region to another as to whether we might think it's a good idea or a bad idea, but at least there's an opportunity to be a little bit closer to the people and to the communities in the area to decide, you know, what do they want for their water. So I think that's a positive thing. So where would I assess, you know, sort of the accomplishments that we've had in water over the past 50 years or so in Texas? I think that the 1968 Texas Water Plan defeat really set the stage for making progress. And I think we do have to acknowledge that progress has been made. So just a few positive things first, before I talk about the other side of the coin. The state population, you know, actually did reach almost 30 billion by 2020. So the Water Development Board's estimate of the 1968 water plan that we would reach 30 million people was only off by about 1 billion people. It was like about 29 million people. And interestingly enough, I have to say that if you look at some of the Sierra Club literature of 1969, Sierra Club said, you know, based upon our discussions with demographers and others, the population of Texas by 2020 is going to be no more than 60 million people. Well, I'm afraid we were wrong about that. And so the Water Development Board was correct about the population. But what they were not correct about was the water demands. Because by 2020, well, I can give you the actual water use figures in Texas, estimated by the Water Development Board based upon the reports that have to be submitted to the board. In 2020, the actual water use statewide in Texas was 14.7 billion acre feet of water. And you probably know an acre foot of water is, you know, 1 acre foot, 1 acre of water to the depth of 1 foot. It's about 326,000 gallons. So the Water Development Board had estimated in 1969, 68 that we would be using, basically 22 million acre feet of water by 2020. Instead, we were only using 14.7 million acre feet. And that, I guess we all know why. It's sort of obvious why that was the case. It's because we actually did become more efficient in our use of water. The state adopted and the federal government adopted, efficiency standards for toilets, for faucets, for shower heads, and then adopted efficiency standards for clothes washers. The energy efficiency standards have helped lower water use because a lot of water use is dependent upon the energy source used. And other people began putting restrictions on outdoor watering, landscape watering on an ongoing basis. And so all this resulted in really a pretty fantastic reduction overall in per capita water use. So I think in 2004 or so, it was estimated that if you just did a gross gallons per capita per day calculation for all the water used in the state of Texas divided by the population of Texas, and of course, we're not talking here just about people using water in their homes. We're talking about irrigated agriculture, all that. It was about 162 gallons per capita per day. And now we're talking more in the range of about 120 or so gallons per capita per day statewide. So that's very, important in terms of reduction. And indeed, the latest Texas water plan, which came out for 2022, is estimating that about 1/3 of water that will be needed to meet projected demands by 2070 will come from what is known as demand management. That includes water conservation and drought management. And another percentage, I couldn't quite calculate it based upon how they present their data, but probably maybe another 5% or so will come from direct water reuse, potable water reuse, and other water reuse, water recycling. So that's pretty, I think, laudable and a great accomplishment. And so the latest water plan, the 2022 plan, projects that by 2070, our statewide water demands will be about 19.2 million acres of acre feet of water per year. And that's compared to what our development board had initially said in 1968 would be like 22 million acre feet per year by 2020. So that's pretty impressive. Now, I have to say that I still think that's like an over projection of what we actually need, but that's a much better projection than what we had before. So there's progress that's been made. And of course, back in 1968 or 69, there was very little talk about protecting bays and estuaries. There was a little bit in the 1968 water plan that said basically, if we bring all this water from the Mississippi, we can send a little bit of it to each of the bays and estuaries along the Texas coast. But of course, you had been building all these reservoirs to capture water, and then you'd be sending a little trickle down to the bays and estuaries. So environmentalists weren't particularly impressed by that. But now we have a lot more discussion focused on environmental flows than we had before. Although, I still hear people say that we're wasting all this water to the Gulf of Mexico, because we're not capturing it and using it for consumptive purposes. And I'm always amazed anytime these days I hear somebody say that, especially a politician. I'm going, didn't we disabuse ourselves of that notion like 50 years ago? But apparently not. All right, so what are the challenges that remain other than that kind of attitude? Well, our laws and practices for maintaining environmental flows are not strong we passed legislation, we set up a process for coming up to environmental flow standards. But the fact of the matter is that the vast majority of the volume of water, surface water in the state, had already been allocated through water rights before we even established an environmental flow standard setting process. Now, that water is not all being used and consumed, but it is a water right that's held by by many large water purveyors. So yes, we have an environmental flow standard setting process, but in many river basins in the state, the vast majority of the surface water was already allocated before we set any standards. And so, yes, any new water rights that are issued will have to abide by the environmental flow standards, but those environmental flow standards don't really provide the protections that are needed for our bays and estuaries. We're just lucky that people who have water rights are not using all those water rights right now to the fullest allotment that they could. Also, I think that there's still some politicians who have very grandiose ideas about moving water around the state. One of your own state representatives from the San Antonio area, Representative Larson, who I have a love-hate relationship with. He's good on some things like water conservation, but he had a proposal in 2015 to set up a state water grid to move water around the state. I nicknamed it the water gridzilla because it was a monstrous idea, in my opinion, to move all that water around the state. He actually, tried to pass legislation for a study of a state water grid. He's an opponent of our current water planning process because he thinks it leads to a balkanization of water, that people are just holding on to their own water in their own region. They won't share it with other people in the state who want or need that water. I think that's not quite on the mark. But at any rate, Sierra Club opposed the water gridzilla. The bill did not pass the legislature, and so you don't hear very much about it anymore. But this not to say, of course, as you know, that there are not water transfer projects that are still being proposed and being implemented. But it's not the entire state plumbing system that some people would like to establish. Another challenge that we face is that although many people have a clean and dependable water supply, not all Texans do. This is the equity issue. The fact that many communities are still suffering because they don't have adequate water supply, or they don't have a good water quality system to treat waste and dispose of them or deal with them properly. Many socially vulnerable populations are still, especially in the lower Rio Grande Valley, but even in some of our big cities, not enjoying the fruits of our past water planning and our water project funding. Although we do have programs like the EDAP program, as it's called, Economically Disadvantaged Areas Program, Water Development Board, where money is specifically authorized for projects in low-income communities. But most of them are still like loan programs. Some have been grants. Most are loan programs, and a lot of low-income communities cannot afford to borrow money in order to build a project, even if there's a zero interest rate. So that's still an issue. Another issue is that the best management practices for water conservation have not been adopted universally in the state of Texas by all water utilities. Now, I have some qualms, as you know, about San Antonio's water conservation program, but I have to say that San Antonio has one of the best water conservation programs in the state, but a lot of communities do not. Houston, my hometown, where I grew up, still does not have an extensive water conservation program, nowhere near what San Antonio has. And of course, Houston thinks we have all the water we need. We have too much water. We need to get rid of water. We flood. But during times of drought, that is not necessarily the case. Now, they do have a very active new water conservation program leader. She's trying to do a lot, and I hope that she'll be successful. But that unfortunately is all too common in many parts of the state. Although we have a number of communities that have stepped up to the plate. Even, I hate to say this as a Houstonian or past Houstonian, but even Dallas has a better water conservation program than Houston does. And I mentioned today on the conversation with Saws that a lot of people tout the fact that during their drought contingency plan implementation, they limit outdoor landscape watering, to once a week, I guess it is. But other cities like Dallas and Fort Worth and Austin do that on an ongoing basis, not just during times of drought. And for a community like San Antonio that still has a lot of dependence upon the Edwards Aquifer, where you could maintain aquifer levels much better if you had those limitations year-round, I think it just doesn't make any sense not to have that limitation on an ongoing basis. Another thing mentioned today with the virtual meeting with SAWS is that water loss in municipal water distribution systems is incredibly high, especially in the major cities of the state. Now, a lot of professional water utility people don't like to use percentages to compare each other with regard to water loss. And there are new metrics for comparing water loss, but just to make it simple, most of the major cities in Texas still lose anywhere from 12 to 17% of their water through leaky pipelines, water main breaks, in some instances due to metering issues where they don't necessarily account for all the water that's going through the system, but it's mainly the physical losses. And I think the San Antonio Express News had an article back this summer that indicated that there were like 700 water main breaks in San Antonio in July. That basically sometimes billions of gallons of water are lost each year as a result of those breaks and those leaky pipelines in San Antonio. And it is a challenging issue, especially in Texas, especially with some of the soil types we have in certain areas, and especially during a drought situation where the soils are moving and pipelines are likely to break. But it requires a very active operation and maintenance program to keep on top of all that, and it requires money. And that is one thing that I think really the legislature may actually address that to some extent this coming session, because we have a lot of infrastructure funding now coming from the federal government that has to be spent and can be spent for water projects. And there's a lot more discussion among legislators about water loss control in cities. But that is basically a major issue when you're losing billions of gallons of water each year through water loss in your municipal lines. The Texas Living Waters Project, of which Sierra Club is part, released a report, I believe last month, September, about water loss. And you might want to take a look at that, because it indicated that if you were able to curb all the water loss in the state, at least from the major water utilities, you could probably capture and use about over 500,000 acre feet of water in any one year. Now, physically, it's probably not possible to reach that, because that means you'd have to make sure you never had a break and all that. It's very difficult. But if you exercise the best water loss control programs, they estimated that you could at least save about 350,000 acre feet of water a year, which could then actually be used and not, basically then be an incentive for building another water project because you're already losing so much water. Another challenge that we have is that we face climate change, of course. We have some lack of predictability in terms of exactly how it's going to affect each area of the state. And of course, Oz is trying to address that. But we're likely to have a much drier future, although, as was pointed out this afternoon, precipitation may actually increase in some areas as a result of major storm events. But they're going to be more likely to be episodic storm events rather than water precipitation that's spread out over a year. And that requires different ways of addressing the water issue, through water capture and things like that. Another thing that is a challenge is that we still treat groundwater and surface water as if they're two legally distinct things. Groundwater is a private property right. Surface water is owned by the state, although if you get the water right, then that is considered to be, a right, not quite like groundwater is a property right. But we don't manage groundwater and surface water together. And yet there are obvious connections. And we see that with the Edwards Aquifer and the discharge points at San Marcos and Comal Springs. We need to approach that differently. And we still basically treat each aspect of water separately. We don't have a comprehensive water planning program that includes water supply, water quality, flood control, environmental flow protection. It's, we have a water supply planning process. We have a regional flood control planning process. We have an environmental flow standard setting process. We just don't look at it holistically, the so-called one water approach. That is still a challenge. Okay, so what do I think Sierra Club, all of us need to do to address these challenges? Well, some things are pretty obvious. But I guess I'm going to give them to you, not necessarily in rank order, but all these in a way should be priorities, I think, for Sierra Club. And I think they are here in San Antonio and many other parts of the state. First of all, we need to push for funding and statutory protections for in-stream flows and freshwater inflows to basin estuaries. In other words, we need for the money, the legislature to appropriate money to, like the Parks and Wildlife Department, to purchase or lease surface water rights and put them in the water trust, which has very few water rights thus far. Because people are reluctant to just voluntarily give up water right. But if you provide them a financial incentive or are willing to pay to buy their water right, then that can be important for protecting the in-stream flows and freshwater inflows to the basin estuaries. Also, I think we need to have a more aggressive cancellation program for water rights that are not used and aren't expected to be used anytime in the near future. I'm not talking about taking surface water rights away from cities that are growing in population, but people who maybe decades ago got water rights for agricultural irrigation, and they're not using those water rights. Theoretically, they can be canceled, but in practice, there are a lot of obstacles to cancel those water rights and putting them back into the public trust. We need to redouble our efforts to provide safe and dependable water supply for all population groups, especially socially vulnerable populations. And I know that was brought up this afternoon in the virtual meeting with SAWS. And the Sierra Club, I think, has become more and more committed to equity in all aspects of environmental and natural resource policy. But we need to continue to make that a high priority, even higher priority for state government leaders. We need to continue to oppose massive water transfers like Vista Ridge, which are really not necessary and pose threats to the communities from which that water is being taken. I think, as many of you know, we're already seeing signs that the water being pulled out of the aquifer or Vista Ridge is having an impact on local wells in the area from which the water is being pulled. And this is, despite a lot of estimates and projections that would not be the case by the people who pushed for the permit and were issuing the permit. But that also means opposing some of these big reservoir projects like Marvin Nichols up in Northeast Texas. There's Lake Ringgold in Washington, Wichita Falls, or Fort Washington, Wichita Falls. I have to point out this is an interesting thing. Back in the last decade, as you may be aware, Wichita Falls became sort of the poster child for water shortage because their drought continued long after the 2011 single-year drought. And they even went to the point of building a potable water reuse facility. And so they were actually, treating wastewater and using it for potable purposes. Well, now they want to, and they have some other water sources as well. Well, now they want to build a new lake. And once they build the new lake, they're thinking they could then basically mothball their potable reuse plant. And so this is like the exact opposite from my point of view as to the direction we ought to be taking this state. Here you've accomplished something for which you got a lot of credit and which you showed a lot of dexterity and a lot of, innovation to do. And now you're thinking, I'm going to build a reservoir. Though now I don't really need this anymore, at least not for the time being. So that's an example of a direction we should not be taking. We need to provide incentives for utilities to practice better water loss control. And what I'm saying here is that it's good to have water project funding for replacing aging infrastructure so we have less water main breaks, less leaky pipelines. But the problem is that you can't just put that new infrastructure into the ground and expect that takes care of your problem. You need to have an active operation and maintenance program, a monitoring program to make sure that you detect leaks when they happen and take care to address those, or to take steps to prevent them in the first place wherever you can. And we don't have that because if you get a loan from the state, it's for building infrastructure, and then you have to pay back that loan. What we really need are grants, technical assistance, model programs about how a community can actually curb their water loss and maintain that water loss control over a period of time. We need more innovative water supply projects. That includes like more gray water systems, more zero water use systems for commercial buildings, low impact development incentives, plumbing code changes to really require low impact development, community-based rainwater collection systems. Meredith and I have been talking about that. My wife and I have a rainwater storage collection system that we treat, and we use that water for our potable water supply where we live out in the country, and Meredith does too. And I'm not going to say it's not expensive, believe me, I'm not going to say that. And it requires maintenance. You have to stay on top of it, and you have to actually stop being just a water policy expert and learn about the technical aspects of rainwater collection, which I've had to do. I've learned a lot in the last 3 years about rainwater collection and maintenance. But I think it's possible not only to do that on an individual household basis where you have the resources to do it, but also potentially on a neighborhood or community basis in some areas where it makes a lot more sense to do that than to continue to deplete groundwater supplies or to depend upon massive influx of water from other areas of the state. And I hope that's something that SAWS will, give some serious thought to. We need to ensure that regional and state water plans truly address climate change impacts. There's some sort of squirrely ways that they do it now. And Water Development Board does allow planning groups now to plan for droughts more severe than the 1950s drought record. That's a two-edged sword, though, because what it means in some areas is that you can find some planning groups that say, okay, we need to build more water projects then, more reservoirs, et cetera, because we're going to have a drought worse than the 1950s drought. But what I hope that it translates into is we're going to become more innovative and far looking far out to how to approach that. We need more research into groundwater and surface water connections to point out where they exist and where that should govern our water policy problem, our programs. We need more funding for, well, we need funding, period, for a statewide public education program on water. The state set up a water education program, or authorized, I should say, in the 2007 water legislation. And that was great, but they never funded it. So whereas the Texas Department of Transportation has this major Don't Mess with Texas program against litter, for water, which is arguably one of the most important issues we have in the state, there is no statewide program funded by Texas state government. Now, I'm on the board of the Texas Water Foundation, which is a private organization, and we have now established a state water education program called Texas Runs on Water, which has gotten some traction in several areas. But it's just being funded by a few $100,000 from grants from groups like the Meadows Foundation in Dallas. What we need is a multi-million-dollar education program that is funded by the state and can really supplement or augment the programs done by groups like SAWS. Because an interesting statistic is that shortly after the passage of the 1997 water package, there was a public opinion poll done and some focus groups done to determine what prompted people to basically take charge of their water supply and conserve and protect it. And what that polling showed and the focus group showed was that if you knew the source of your water, you were more likely to protect and conserve that water supply. And we've seen that in San Antonio, with the Edwards Aquifer being the sole source of water for San Antonio for so long. People knew where their water came from. And so, people would look at the newspaper each day or online each day to see what's the level of the Edwards Aquifer. They took steps to conserve water. I think that's one of the reasons why San Antonio's been very successful in water conservation. Well, in some cases, though, people don't know where their water comes from. And so they don't have this concept of, I need to take these steps to protect that water supply. So the more we can educate people about where their water comes from, why it's important to conserve, why they should not overwater their lawns, because even if you do have the traditional landscape, you don't need to put as much water on it as most people put on it. Those are the types of educational things we need. And we need to promote true one water policies where we don't just segregate each water issue into a silo of its own and not have cooperation, coordination, and discussion and conversation. And this can be done through interlocal agreements between, say, a city and a flood control district, between basically the Water Development Board and some communities, lots of ways of doing it. We're probably not going to do away totally with the separate legal frameworks for these things, but we need to do more to try to strike through those barriers between them. And the final thing I will say in terms of meeting the water challenges of the future is, pretty obvious, but bears repeating. We need to be vigilant and resilient as an environmental organization, as citizens, as individuals, in monitoring what's happening with our environment and taking action whenever there's a new threat or circumstances change. I often point out to people that while I support groups like the Nature Conservancy and others that, buy land or set aside land or, get enough to hold land and provide it to a state agency like the Parks and Wildlife Department, that's all very important. But as you've probably seen in some local fairly local samples, you can set aside areas like the Honey Creek Preserve, for example. But then you have a subdivision development that comes in near that preserve and threatens to harm the water quality of the preserve. That's the kind of thing that, really proves to me the point that we need to be constantly vigilant about what we think we protected and making sure that we continue to protect it. And that requires our being willing to spring into action whenever we see the need to do that. Oh, I know. Believe me. I get all of Annalisa's emails, believe me. All right, so just in conclusion, I do appreciate again the opportunity to come talk about water with you. I was a history major at Texas Lutheran, and so I tend to focus a lot on how important it is to know, for us to know about history. And I think in the case of water in Texas, it's doubly important. First, for the reason that you need to know what has happened before and what is likely to happen again, i.e. the water plan versus the water grid of a few years ago. But also you need to understand that we have made progress. It hasn't been just a zero. It hasn't been a game of, we lose, they win. We have made progress, but there's a lot more ahead of us. And the more we understand what progress we made and how we made that progress, the better able, I think, we're able to then move toward the future to have a more secure water future for Texas. So thanks for the time, opportunity. I'm happy to discuss some things with you if you have time. Sure. Yeah, Jerry.
What, we're talking about a 5 million acre feet water difference here. Is that going to, how is that going to be affected by extended drought and stuff like this? Is this going to make people use less? Do you think it's going to make new water? Is it going to actually increase bad projects, or is it going to be maybe desalination and things like this? You gotta do something to get that water. And what do you think is going to happen?
Well, let me sort of separate this into what I think should happen and what is going to happen.
Well, I want to know what is going to happen.
All right. As Karen Gus said this afternoon during the virtual meeting some of us had with SARS, our experience is that during the drought, people start using more water, at least initially. They see that the rain isn't falling. They got this landscaping they want to protect, and they start applying more water. And unfortunately, a lot of our drought contingency plans don't spring into action quickly enough to, try to curb that water use. And so the initial thing in a drought is going to be, I think, more water use, at least, by certain segments of the population, like single-family residential properties and all that. But I do think that as a drought continues, that obviously more regulations sometimes kick in. I do think more people become more attuned to the fact that there is a water shortage and they have to cut back, and that they, are often willing to step up to the plate to do that. And I think there are studies that indicate that once people have responded to a drought by cutting back certain non-essential water uses and all that, the water use during, quote, normal times, unquote, does not automatically spring back to where it was. There is some, conservation learning so that people understand, yeah, I could get by with less water than I used to use before. So I think that will be an element. I also think that it probably will mean more desalination proposals. I don't think that's necessarily bad. Desalination is one of those things where I think, it's reasonable to consider it if the economics are there, if the energy use is appropriate, like renewable energy rather than coal-fired power plant or whatever, and where you take good stewardship of the concentrate or brine discharge, and don't just discharge it into a bay or estuary, which is what is being discussed. Corpus Christi taking water out of a bay or estuary and then putting the brine discharge back into it. It should be put out much farther into the Gulf where there's less possibility of it impacting negatively the environment. So I think, and there are many brackish desalination, many brackish groundwater zones around the state where you could potentially do desalination. Although I keep pointing out to people that well, I shouldn't put it in this context, but there's a large volume of brackish groundwater in the state of Texas. I do have to point out that when you use that brackish groundwater to treat it for potable purposes, you're essentially mining water, because that brackish water is there because of eons of things that have gone before it. It's not like the Edwards aquifer, recharging. The brackish groundwater is usually
Right. So basically the freshwater cycle is there. It's liable to get drier. So we're not creating water in real sense. We're manipulating, managing, and you're going to take however you manage, it's going to have some negative positive effects. So that's the real long-term management thing.
That is the dilemma, but it is still true that we can become a lot more efficient in our use of water. I think we can do a lot more wastewater recycling that will stretch our water supplies. And we should certainly start first with things like the water loss control, where we obviously have fresh water that's being lost every year and could be captured and used. So that I really don't know. My crystal ball really doesn't tell me exactly what's going to happen. But I do take heart in the fact, again, that whereas in 1968, we estimated, water development did, that we would be using 22 million acre feet of water per year by 2 years ago, and we only use 14.7 million acre feet. And we're not projecting to use 22 million even in 50 years. It's close, 19.7. We made a lot of progress. We've shown that we can do a lot more with a lot less water. And I think that's, the message that we as a Sierra Club continue to promote, that we be more innovative and we be more efficient in our use of water.
So the also give you any assurance that they're going to work on the water loss thing? What did they say?
They didn't say anything today about that.
Well, sorry.
Well, I think Annalisa has a question.
Yeah.
For atmospheric water generators.
Mhm.
They
Yeah.
have them now where they can run on solar.
Right.
They're very efficient. And I know of one system at least that's been used on the state. So y'all considering that.
I really not looked into that very much. I'm aware of it, but I haven't looked into it. I'm always a little concerned about new, silver bullet ideas, and so I'd like to see more about the facts of that. Sure.
We have been actively learning.
Right. Oh, that would never happen. Yeah.
And at some point, we really do need to just by geography. But maybe we should also be.
Sure.
And does that ever enter?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. But
Oh, my God.
yeah, I mean, we can agree among ourselves that that should happen. It doesn't seem to be carrying a lot of weight with, government leaders or other institutions for that matter, which shall remain nameless, that don't agree with that. The one thing I would caution you about, I mean, I think population growth has a lot of impacts. It's not just the water, it's obviously, all the other impacts of sprawl. But what we have shown is that the population can grow by a considerable amount. And because of our water efficiency and water conservation efforts, it's not impacting our water as much as had been estimated. And I will still point out that in Texas, 55% of the water used in the state in 2020 was irrigated agriculture. Well, to feed more people or grow more cotton or more corn for feedlots, yeah, I mean, but let's face it, the irrigated agriculture in the panhandle is not going to last another 100 years or so. And right now, the bulk, not all of it, but the bulk of that 55% of our water use each year is going to irrigated agriculture in the panhandle. And maybe the panhandle is just not the area to, for all that agriculture. Although, as a wine drinker, knowing that 85% of our grapes grown in Texas come from the panhandle, I don't want to do away with all irrigated agriculture there just yet. But no, seriously, I think we tend to forget when we talk about our future water needs or demands that still the biggest single use of water in the state is irrigated agriculture. And it's not sustainable. It's not terribly efficient. Yeah, I mean, and at the same time, we're gobbling up a lot of agricultural land for subdivisions, like Austin now, there's a lot of growth in Austin to the east of Austin, which is fine in terms of protecting the fragile hill country, but they're basically putting subdivisions in what used to be agricultural land. It was not irrigated agriculture either. It was basically dry land farming. Oh yeah, yeah. East of Austin. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think the only way you really do it is by pointing out, emphasizing, who benefited from it and any corruption or whatever that's tied to it. Because I think, we're in a strange time in a way, because obviously there are a lot of people in Texas and across the country now who are very leery about government, they want government control. They're sort of, at least potentially responsive to arguments about, private business coming in and doing things, entrepreneurship and all that, whether or not that's valid. And to some extent, I think it's going to be, helping people to understand the role that government plays, and that we are better off, for the most part, in having a government that's responsive to the public, being in charge of water supply systems and water projects and other things like that, rather than giving it over to a private concern over which we don't have any control. But unfortunately, P3 is still, a positive buzzword for a lot of legislators. And I think you're going to see more effort to incentivize and facilitate P3 projects in the future. Now, one thing that is good in a number of respects is that the infrastructure funding coming from the federal government is going to put a lot of money into infrastructure projects, including water projects. And so P3 is not as important there because you have the funding that otherwise P3 might, require from some people's perspective. But, it sort of gets back to the whole democracy thing we're debating as a country now, you can use the argument that you want the builders and infrastructure project to be responsive to people. But a lot of people just want things done. They don't care about whether whoever's in charge is responsive. They just want it done. Whether it's good or bad. Barbara? I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. Was there something?
Barbara had a question.
Okay. I was gonna add, I went here with cows, beef, baby, salsa, which is a very
Right.
good crop like cotton. So,
Okay, you work on that. I'm still eating beef. Sorry. But grass fed beef. Yeah. I don't know the percentage. And there haven't,
That's two big ones right there.
oh yeah, there haven't been really a lot of P3 water projects in the state. Highways and all that, yeah, but it's just, you did see the Texas legislature turn against toll roads and all, so, so there's some, I guess, positive aspect to that. I don't know about percentages, but.
It's just, that's a really good argument.
Right. Right. Well, we need more people talking about it, and we need politicians talking about it. Right now, I don't see a lot of politicians talking about it. Find one that,
I just wanted to say that I could hear them all these and way up in the speaker. I said I could just listen and watch the faces when certain comments were made. I mean, I am just so proud to be a part of this organization, and there were a couple of things that happened, and for those of you who were there, if you disagree, please say. But we're talking about, you've got surface water versus like the springs and the underground water. And so those are separated, and then Alan pointed out, well, FOSS doesn't really do what Sarah does for floodwaters and for, but kind of the fact that was your point, everybody kind of went, I've never heard anything like that. Was that the?
well, I think more and more people are thinking of that way at the professional level, not just the public.
Yeah, that's all I
Yeah.
brought it up. And
Yeah.
I was just really shocked. And it was, well, I just really felt like y'all got further today than I've ever seen. Of course. That was a big topic of discussion. Yes, the day
On Monday
before.
night,
Yeah.
and that was a big topic of the discussion, because we're working on.
Yeah.
But what was the problem was that when we talked about, like conservation programs, leverage with water, utilities. Stormwater plans and things, they.
Right.
Really
That's
And the other thing
pretty
that I
bad.
heard today was they asked y'all, do you want to work?
Your work is done. After the draft.
Right.
Because I said, maybe we could work together, or move together. I've never heard sauce.
Yeah, and I think, just frankly, I think that once the draft plan comes out, once you're able to review it, and I'll try to find some time to review it myself, if you want me to. I think need to come up with a good message about what you find in it, the good and the bad. And we need to talk about a strategy for communicating that message to the larger population, and obviously between the Sierra Club and other groups. because, you know, I'm not quite as optimistic as Karen about them listening to us. I mean, I think the people probably, you know, in the meeting today are the ones most likely to maybe want to listen to us, but there's this board of,
Oh,
you
yeah.
know,
Yeah.
which obviously directs a lot of what's going on there. But I think what, you know, they can sometimes just sort of set us to the side and dismiss some of our ideas by saying, oh, that's just the Sierra Club, or it's just Kia, you know, it's not what the larger public thinks, or the larger public isn't even tuned in. Well, that's true. But if there's anybody who can overcome the chamber, it's more likely to be the general public that is activated and motivated to make comments and put pressure on them.
And we try to make things comply with social justice and not with justice.
Right.
They have a big voice.
Right.
They're willing to block them.
Yeah. I mean, I still remember the impact that cops, you know, had in San Antonio, beginning of the 80s and 90s, especially.
And I think that information is saving more. You know,
Yeah.
before, we actually have a really good college board right now, but I'm very concerned because three of the good members in the New York are in. Gone in 2023, and so far, every nominee that we've endorsed has been frankly disparaged because they were not Latino or Latino specifically. So we're going to have to do some work to make sure that we get because two of the candidates that would I wonder if we could get one on the well, we can talk about that later, but I just wanted y'all to be aware that because the board has been really good at having things. Endorsed from the get-go. And Britta is one of the people who, you know, when her family refused to move, and her house was condemned, but is now a parking lot of San Antonio. They stayed there after their family. And her philosophy as an advocate for Native Americans, of which she is one, that we need to respect the earth. And then if we learn to respect the earth, we respect each other. That asks, I'd really like to see her Elm Street thing, and that was gonna go, except that we had COVID.
Well, I think you make a good point that, you know, we shouldn't just look within our own community, if you will, of environmentalists to push somebody or to endorse somebody, but build those alliances with other people and identify people in the community and at large who, you know, have some passion and who are educable on some of the things that we're interested in. I've certainly, you know, I've been surprised sometimes, like, you know, with the Texas Water Development Board. There have been some changes now in the Water Development Board, but like the three people who are on the Water Development Board, who were all appointed by Governor Abbott, who's not my hero, turned out to be really good on the Water Development Board. They embraced conservation. They were very open to us. I mean, we had an extremely open door policy in terms of listening to our viewpoints and our being able to talk to them and, you know, really taking our views to heart. We just lucked out in a way, I guess, you know, with the right people at the right time. But we shouldn't automatically think that, like, just because somebody's appointed by a politician we don't agree with, or just because this person isn't from our community, that they're not potentially going to be our ally. I think we need to take a broader view of that. Yeah.
I want to say, you know, we have a real good element because San Antonio water system always, there's always
something different. I thought about this a lot. Because for other people, even though members of the Sierra Club that you're talking about, because he really has not just the presentations and facts he's presenting, but he walks in there with this attitude that we care about this and you should too. Not the attitude of you are evil. I mean, honestly, we have a past president of this organization that could not say anything about East Blue Ridge without always putting in print something about something that the husband, one of the trustees did or something, you know, and you start bringing in all this other stuff. That tells people you don't really want to work with them. I mean, who wants that?
There were a lot of people today sitting in this room that were on that board. You guys were all treated with a great deal of respect. What do you call that? Persistence?
Right, persistence.
Yeah.
It does work, it's very slow. So in our philosophy, it's always been battleship, it's move battleship, it's two ways to move. Run up, bang, and get it, fist. A lot of people. That's really why we do that.
Well, yeah, I mean, personally, I do agree with the idea that you treat other people as you would want them to treat you. And even if they have a different perspective, political, or otherwise, you need to respect the fact that, you know, they feel that as strongly probably as you feel your own perspective, and find some common ground. That's very difficult to do, especially these days. But the thing is that on the water issue, one of the reasons I'd like to work on the water issue above a lot of other issues is that it's not necessarily a conservative versus liberal issue, a Republican versus Democratic issue. Maybe it's a little rural versus urban sometimes. But you know, there are people who can agree about the importance of water, and they can agree at least at some level about the need to protect and conserve it. You just need to find those points of agreement and sort of build on that to something that comes up with a policy that, you know, can embrace the appropriate way of going forward. Yeah.
Are you still going to be having festival water?
No. I've said publicly to the leadership of the chapter, I'm not going to be lobbying for the Sierra Club this coming session. I have done it now since, well, directly since 1982. That's 40 years by my math. I did it for, and I was a legislative chair on a volunteer basis for the chapter for 5 years prior to that. So it's been a long time. My wife keeps pointing out that technically I am retired. Theoretically. So now I'm not going to quit working on water. I'm still going to be on the regional water planning group. I'm going to be on 2 of the stakeholder groups for environmental flows, the Brazos and the Trinity Sand Center. I'm still going to be on the board of the Water Foundation, which I think is a good water education organization. And I'm still going to be active with what's known as TWCA, Texas Water Conservation Association, which is really not conservation, but it's a very important arena for debating water policy.
I really appreciate how your specialty.
I'll still be keeping an eye on the legislative session. And I'm more than willing to talk, you know, and talk strategy or whatever. I'm going to remain the source. And but as far as Sierra Club's going to, as far as my Sierra Club involvement, I'm going to focus basically on trying to capture some of the history of the Sierra Club amongst our chapter over the last 50 years and make sure that that history is known to people or accessible to people. And I also have some hope of writing a lot more about water water policy and water history. So you may see part of this presentation in another form. Okay, one more question.
Yeah, so we don't get locked in.
Oh, yeah, don't get locked in.
The park.
Yeah, I have to get a lift back to the hotel.
I just wanted to bring up one wonderful innovative idea. Fellow here named Brian demonstrated to Sarah and different agencies here a unique way to save water. And that is to move the contributing donors, maybe land project. And his idea is take, instead of all of water running off land and going into the river, put a bird. Water would go down.
Yeah,
Really, I was taking that, we're getting.
yeah,
And they
Yeah.
actually build things to make the water. Well,
right.
thank you.
Thank you.
so much.
Yeah,
Yeah.
enjoyed it. I don't know how you.
So did Diane come with you today or, you know?
She likes to stay.
No, but in record. Oh, it has. You're being the farmer now again, right? That's great.
Well, yeah, she's the farmer.
Up in the left-hand corner. Just click
Oh, I
it.
see.
So what's your daughter?
Stop recording. Okay. Yes.